This is Chapter 7 of the American Government class, talking about the executive branch. We're going to be breaking it into two lectures. This one will be talking about the structure of the executive branch, and the next one will talk about the bureaucratic function of the executive branch. Okay, let's do this, y'all. Here is a org chart of the federal government. Over here, we have the legislative branch, Congress, which we've already talked about, and the various departments that are associated with Congress. Over here, we have the judicial branch, which we'll be talking about later, and the various courts that are in that. And then, as you can see, everything else is the executive branch. So it is very large, about 3 million people that are in the federal government. And so what we're going to be doing for this lecture is talking a little bit about the executive office of the president and the inner circle of the president's offices there. Then we're going to be talking about the 4 basic types of executive agencies in the federal government. Up here are the 15 cabinet level departments, and here is just a very small sampling of the independent agencies, the government corporations, and some of the regulatory commissions that we'll be looking at. Looking at the inner office of the president, also called the executive office of the president. These are the closest advisors of the president. These offices, in some cases, are not necessarily approved by the Senate. We'll talk about a couple of these. Of course, obviously, the Council of Economic Advisors is advising the president on economic affairs. The Office of Trade Representative is a relatively new office that was established back in the 1960s when the president started to take on a little bit more of the trade negotiations as well. So we can talk a little bit more detail about the National Security Council, which advises the president on security affairs. These are the people that typically sit in on the National Security Council. The National Security Advisor is the chief person of this particular group that advises the president. Along with the vice president, we also see that the secretaries of the state, treasury, and defense are the 3 most important cabinet department heads that sit in on this meeting. The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staffs, we'll see in a minute, is overseeing the armed branches of the armed forces. We'll look at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence here a little bit more, Chief of Staff, Counsel to the President. So these are fairly regular meetings that the president has with the National Security Council with those people involved. Now let's look a little bit in more detail at the Director of National Intelligence, which was established after 9/11 in order to try to coordinate all the intelligence activities the federal government does. And so as you can see, that there is about 17 different agencies that were scattered all over the government that were collecting intelligence. The failure of these groups to coordinate their intelligence is part of what the 9/11 Commission report found, failing to connect the dots. Obviously, the CIA is one of the most important intelligence gathering offices, but the Department of Defense has several groups that are gathering intelligence. And as you can see down here, there's other cabinet level departments that actually have intelligence units within their departments as well. So the Director of National Intelligence was a new position created back in 2004 that was tasked to coordinate all of these agencies into one intelligence report, and then that person would be a member of the executive office of the president that would report to the president on these intelligence activities as they were coordinated. Now, in this lecture, we're going to talk about 4 basic types of organizations. First, we're going to look at the cabinet level departments, which are headed by the Secretary of. Specifically, we'll be looking at the third tier bureaus within those cabinet departments, because those are the organizations that are actually doing the work of government. As well, they're not an administrative office or an executive office or a vice presidential office. These are, as you'll see very clearly as we go through these org charts of some of these cabinet departments, you'll see what I mean by the third tier bureaus, where the work is actually getting done. Then we'll look at what are called the independent agencies, and they're independent for a reason. Examples include NASA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the CIA. We'll also look a little bit more in depth at what are called government corporations. They are set up by the government to do their own business, such as the Post Office, the Federal Reserve, Amtrak, and the government-sponsored enterprises such as Fannie Mae. And then we'll look at the regulatory commissions that are have the familiar acronyms: Federal Trade Commission, Federal Communications Commission, Federal Elections Commission. Those are some examples of those. So let's look at those 4 different types of organizations. Here is the 15 cabinet level departments that we saw earlier in the overall org chart. There's 15 of them. The Homeland Security is the newest addition that was added not long after 9/11 in order to try to get a new agency that is coordinating Homeland Security. So let's look at some org charts here. This is the U.S. Department of Transportation. And as you look through these upper level offices up here, these all have executive this, assistant secretary for that, and office of this or that. Now, the third tier bureau are these agencies down here, and as you can see, there's a reason why they're called third tier bureaus. You know, first tier, second tier, third tier, but the third tier bureaus are the ones where the business does not change. When a new president is elected, that president is going to be appointing lots of new people that are going to be perhaps loyal to that president's agenda, or at least somebody that they feel like that they can depend on for running that office. But these, even though they may have appointment heads that are appointed as well, these groups down here are the ones that conduct the business of government and have to keep conducting that business regardless of who the new president is. And some of these I'm sure you are aware of. The FAA, very well-known group that's in the transportation department. There's the FHA, Federal Highway Administration, which looks at all the rules and regulations. Here's the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration that also looks at safety rules and regulations. And we'll look at this one again here in a little bit to show you the difference between a cabinet department in the third tier bureau as opposed to an independent agency who may be an investigative arm that needs to be separate from this particular group right here. The title was cut off of this one, but as you can see by looking at some of these offices here, this is the Department of Health and Human Services. These are all the office ofs are all over here. And as you can see, the third tier bureaus are kind of structured here in the middle. Some of these I'm sure you have heard of quite a bit before. There's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC. The FDA is also in this group right here. The National Institutes of Health does a lot of research on the health of our society. Here's a very busy group right here that administers Medicare and Medicaid, 2 of the biggest programs in all of government. So those are some examples, just a few, of the third tier bureaus in the Department of Health and Human Services. This is the Department of Justice. We do not call the head of this department, we do not call them the Secretary of Justice. We call them the Attorney General. They're the the top lawyer for the United States. We can see a lot of office of here. The Solicitor General over here is the position that specifically handles the Supreme Court cases representing the government. But the third tier bureaus are right here, and several of these I'm sure you're familiar with. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. Here we have the DEA right here. This one is one you may be familiar with. Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, and maybe something else eventually. U.S. Marshals Service here. The International Police Agency, the U.S. Attorney's Office here, where every state has a U.S. attorney that's appointed to that state that is somewhat of a liaison between the federal government and the state. And in New Jersey, for example, George Bush appointed Chris Christie as U.S. Attorney to New Jersey, and then Christie took that job on, was fairly successful at it, which parlayed into him being elected governor of New Jersey after that. So those are some third-tier bureaus in the Department of Justice. Now here's the newest cabinet-level department, the Department of Homeland Security, which was established, first of all, as an executive order by George W. Bush. As soon as it was established, they felt like that it wasn't going to have enough clout unless it was a full cabinet-level department. And in 2003, Congress passed the bill that created the Department of Homeland Security. Now, Homeland Security had to be cobbled together by putting agencies into it that had previously been somewhere else. Here are the third-tier bureaus of Homeland Security. So if you've traveled through an airport recently, you're probably familiar with the TSA. These are the three groups that are responsible for immigration, border protection, customs enforcement. Down here, formerly, this one used to be called Border Patrol. The U.S. Secret Service, which is tasked with protecting our elected officials as well as involved in counterfeiting. Here is FEMA, which was put into this agency right here. And logically, see, the Coast Guard protecting our shores would be put into this Homeland Security Department as well. So those are the third-tier bureaus for the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Treasury is pretty busy, lots of office ofs, executive office of, etc. So I blew up the third-tier bureaus down here, and some of these maybe have at least heard of. The United States Mint, which coins our money, Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which prints our money, the IRS, which collects our money in the form of taxes. So those are some of the main third-tier bureaus of the Department of the Treasury. Here's the Department of Defense. This includes all three branches of the armed forces, and there's the Joint Chief of Staffs that is part of the Executive Office of the President, that reports to the President and coordinates all the major departments of defense. Now, the Department of Defense actually does have third-tier bureaus as well. These may not be as familiar with. Of course, the NSA been very active, particularly in post 9/11 world with surveillance. The NSA, very prominent agency with probably one of the biggest computer systems in the world. The Defense Intelligence Agency is part of that group that is coordinated by the Director of National Intelligence, and they were very active, this group right here, as far as the intelligence in the run-up to the Iraq War. And this group right here, called DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, has an interesting history. It was developed not long after the Sputnik incidents, where the Soviets beat us up into space with their rocket technology. And so not only did that inspire the space race and missile race and all that kind of stuff as well, but they also created this group in the aftermath of that in order to try to get creative and try to figure out what kind of things can we be researching in order to try to keep up or get ahead of the Soviets in the Cold War. And one of their first earlier projects is that they discovered that our phone system in the United States, AT&T, at that time was a regulated monopoly and very centralized, and they realized that the Soviets could potentially take out a few major hubs of our telephone system and really knock out our communication systems. So therefore, they started experimenting with connecting computers, which were very well into being at that time. So they figured if they could just wire computers together, we could communicate through our computers. And by 1971, they had wired about 15 different computers at 15 different universities spread out over the United States. And that was called the DARPANET. And I guess you can guess where I'm going with that is that they developed the original model for the internet. So that was claim to fame of DARPA. And those are some examples of third-tier bureaus. Now, looking at the Department of Labor, we see the third-tier bureaus down here, some of which you may be familiar with. There's the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That's called OSHA. That was actually initially created as an executive order by President Richard Nixon. Bureau of Labor Statistics comes out with all the employment reports every month. May be familiar with a couple of these others here in the Department of Labor. Department of Agriculture, got quite a few third-tier bureaus here. You may be familiar with Forest Service. The Rural Utilities Service, established during the Depression in order to try to get electricity out to rural areas. Food and Nutrition Service here, Food Safety and Inspection Service, Agricultural Research Service, which is there to help the agricultural industry. Some of those third-tier bureaus there. Now let's talk about independent agencies, and they're independent for a reason. The CIA is an example of an independent agency that has to be tasked with gathering intelligence as to where they think that it is most important, rather than being directed by a various department or group. So that's why they have to stay independent and report directly to the Director of National Intelligence, a la the President. So therefore, they won't be moved according to some political agenda. That's the general idea. So that's why the CIA has kind of had a reputation for being kind of a rogue, and they have had to be reined in a few times over their history as far as getting involved in coups in other countries. Also, post 9/11, CIA kind of had to get reined back in through their rendition, surveillance, and the waterboarding issues, things like that. Now, the EPA is also independent for a reason, because we want the EPA to tackle pollution, again, social costs as a result of our industries putting out pollution or dirty air, dirty water, things like that. And we do not want the EPA to be guided by some department or other agency that's got a political agenda. So therefore, EPA is obviously, it can go from administration to administration, that if somebody is elected that's not necessarily pro-environment, they could appoint officials that might steer the EPA in a certain direction. We might have seen a little bit of that, particularly with the Trump administration. But generally, they are tasked to focus on where the problems are with respect to our environment. NASA was, of course, established with a single-minded goal to get to the moon. Obviously, there was other motivations in order to get ahead of the Soviets in this as well. And of course, a lot of the technology that comes out of that goal really has other far-reaching and broader benefits as well. But they were established, obviously, to focus on that goal to get to the moon and improve our space program. The National Transportation Safety Board, this is the one that I was mentioning earlier that is uniquely independent from the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, because If there is a problem, such as brakes going bad or recall that should have been done or airbags deployed incorrectly and may have hurt or killed somebody, somebody could say, well, the National Highway Transportation or Traffic and Safety Administration should have been regulating that, and maybe they dropped the ball. So therefore, this group right here, the NTSB, needs to be independent because it's an investigation arm more than the regulation arm by the the NHTSA. So there's, you can see why it's important to have an independent agency that can even investigate this group right here, because they may have dropped the ball on their inspections or their regulations, things like that. So we've got an investigation arm here that's independent from the regulation arm that is in the Department of Transportation. Another one here, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, fairly appropriate acronym there. They are independent so that money goes to countries that actually need help in their economic development, and that money therefore not be sent for political reasons or for some, perhaps the State Department is trying to make a negotiation with a country and so they'll task this group to send them money to get them on our side, or perhaps we're trying to get an ally in a conflict, so the Defense Department may want to send that money to them. So the USAID group here is independent so that they can focus on getting this money, which is obviously not a whole lot when you look at it comparatively speaking. But this money needs to go to the countries that they feel like that are going to need it the most for economic development and are going to perhaps use it the most productively. So that's some good examples here as to why they are called independent agencies. Now, our third group of executive agencies are called government corporations, and they are set up by the government to handle a specific business or commercial activity. In other words, they are generating their own income, such as the post office. A post office operated with a profit for quite a long time through postage and selling supplies and things like that. But with the onset of the internet in the 90s, the post office has had financial difficulties for quite a while. They've been trying to figure out how to break even with the post office. Some ideas such as closing on Saturday, but that really has not been a popular alternative. They've also looked at some ideas such as setting up a post office credit union, where the post office could kind of serve as a savings institution as well. Now, the Federal Reserve, or the central bank, is something that we're going to be talking about in more detail later on. But the Federal Reserve obviously is responsible for centralizing the banking system in the United States, and it does make a pretty hefty profit through the interest that it charges on its loans to the banks and the member bank fees, things like that. We'll get into that one in more detail later on. Amtrak, which is subject of criticism at times, particularly in a country that is very much enamored with driving cars and not quite so socialized into public transportation. So anytime there's a problem with Amtrak, it does get a lot of attention as to why we're spending money on a public railway system, but still provides a service. The idea is that if it's a service that people need and want, well, then the user pay method is going to finance it, and the government could then invest in that and get a return on their investment. The government-sponsored enterprises such as Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, they are set up by the government to provide, particularly in these cases, loans, low-interest loans, particularly for homes to enable more people to get into owning their own home. Now, in the 2008 recession, they were caught up into the subprime mortgage, kind of lost their independence for a bit, but they have recovered from that, are now back into the GSE game as far as providing lower interest loans to people to get into the homes. So those are the primary examples of government corporations that are set up to handle their own business, kind of like regulated monopolies in a way. And the regulatory commissions are the ones that are doing the rulings on each particular sector of society, whether they're ruling on trade deals, ruling on election rules, ruling on product safety. These are just one of many examples of regulatory commissions. Commodity Futures Trading Commission was looking over the trading of futures that took a hit when they dropped the ball with respect to derivatives market that assisted with our recession. Of course, the Securities and Exchange Commission also could have been fault a little bit on that. And here's another example of why these are separate from the departments, the cabinet level departments, because the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission is ruling on these issues of safety and health rather than making the regulations themselves, such as OSHA in the Department of Labor. So OSHA makes the rules and regulations and does the inspections, and then if there's a problem, then OSHRC, the regulatory commission here, does the oversight and rulings on those.